Thank you so much for being here, everyone, and for attending the first ever North Carolina Composting Council's ComCon, Composting Conversations. This is in celebration of International Compost Awareness Week, also known as ICA. ICA is the largest and most comprehensive education initiative of the composting industry. And the goal of ICA is to work together to raise public awareness on why we should all be composting and using compost. It is celebrated worldwide each year with events held during the second week in May, just like this one. ICA efforts also include a poster and video contest held each fall based on a theme. Behind me, you can see the winner of this year's poster contest. The theme was for healthier soil, healthier food, compost. And the winner was Jun Chi Tan of Singapore. It just goes to show you this is truly an international celebration, and it shows that compost has the power to unify people all around the world for healthy soils, for healthy food, for our beautiful earth. And I also want to give a shout out and credit to the incredible Renee Wallace. She's executive director of Food Plus Detroit. She held the first compost conversation last year during ICA, presented about it at a session that I was in. And I want to say thank you, Renee, for the inspiration and for letting us use this idea. You can read more about her work in the March 6th National Cultivating Community Composting Forum blog by Biocycle Magazine, as well as on the Food Plus Detroit Facebook page and other social media. She's a huge USCC volunteer and a force in the composting industry. Speaking of which, I also want to thank the North Carolina Composting Council for supporting ICA and now ComCon. This is the first. We hope to have more in the future. The North Carolina Composting Council is a nonprofit chapter of the U.S. Composting Council, and we're comprised of about 60 members statewide and governed by a volunteer board of directors, 4 of whom at least are on the call now. I am the board president, and I pulled together this week's program with the generous contributions of time and talent by the volunteer speakers. A number of our speakers this week are also board members. The work of the board and of the council is done through committee, and they're also all volunteers. If you are interested in learning more, doing more, please visit the North Carolina Compost website or email info@compostingcouncil.com. I also want to thank my employer, the City of Durham, who supports me supporting the efforts of composting around the state and internationally, apparently. So the woman managing the Zoom room, kernels in the chat, who created the gorgeous outreach poster you all saw, and she's handled all the registrations and all the other technology, including the social media that boosted this event, is Kate Sullivan, North Carolina Composting Council Treasurer and Treasurer. Thank you so much, Kate, for your good work here. Thank you to the speakers and for all of you for being here. The way this is going to go is we are going to mute all participants except the speakers while they give a talk. It's going to last about 30 minutes. And during their talks, we encourage all participants to use the chat, say who you are, where you're from, and ask any questions related to the topics at hand. After the speakers have finished, we will unmute the group and start the conversation. Folks can just chime in like you would in a conversation. We do ask that people limit their share to about 4 minutes or so to give everybody the opportunity. Kate will close out the session with a few exciting announcements. And without any further ado, please let me introduce our first host, Robert Satterfield of Atlas Organics.
Hey, thanks, Mariel. Let me share my screen real quick. All good?
You're good to go.
Awesome. Hey, yeah, glad to be here. My name is Robert Satterfield. I am a North Carolina Composting Council board member as well. I've been with Atlas Organics, which produces compost throughout the U.S. My role began with Atlas as an operator. I was actually in the field learning the basics of making compost, and then moved into a business development role in 2019. And since then, grown within the company to handle the sales of Atlas on the East Coast. So I've had some experience with different types of compost, different types of customers, and just wanted to give some of the things that I've seen that are extremely helpful to understand as a buyer of compost, And a lot of the things that I would say, a lot of the confusion that can come with compost or soil or dirt, different names for very different things, but they can all be grouped into one. So we're kind of going to go into that. But yeah, so one of the first things is what is compost, right? And this is a very scientific definition. And if I was selling compost, I probably wouldn't throw this out as my first definition, but compost is the product manufactured through the controlled aerobic biological decomposition of biodegradable materials. The product has undergone mesophilic and thermophilic temperatures, which significantly reduces the viability of pathogens and weed seeds and stabilizes the carbon such as beneficial to plant growth. So a lot of words there, a lot of bigger words, but and just in addition to that, is compost is typically used as a soil amendment, but also can contribute to plant nutrients as well. So that's kind of a wordy definition. Some of the benefits, when I'm going to talk with a customer, I'm going to bring up are, organic matter, right? That is one of the first things before we get into nutrients and everything else we're going to talk about is a weed-free source of organic matter. And like we talked about in the previous slide, or I just mentioned in the definition, because of how compost is made through the temperatures that it reaches, it basically burns, kills off weed seeds if done correctly. Also, one of the other things that we bring up, especially in large agriculture, would be it helps soil retain nutrients. A lot of larger ag is used to, using quite a bit of fertilizer. While they're still going to do that, if we can get them to understand that using compost helps retain those nutrients longer, it's very valuable. Which I would say, out of all the different verticals or different groups you can sell to, agriculture can be the most challenging, depending on what kind of compost you have. And we'll go into that into a later slide. But as you can see, lots of different benefits that compost provides. So one of the biggest, I guess I want to say, that can be confusing is, what is compost versus soil? What is compost? I'll have somebody call me and say, hey, I need some dirt, or hey, I need some soil. And you really have to, if you want to, do it correctly, you need to ask the questions from the sales perspective on what they're talking about, or what are they doing. So one of the things, the definition of compost we already talked about over here on the left. And then the biggest confusion is really compost versus topsoil. We found that a lot down, especially at some of our Florida locations. There seems to be a pretty, basically called the same thing, in which they do very different things, right? Now, compost can be added to topsoil, to make what people call a 50-50 blend, or something that can kind of set off some of the compost's heat. You can use topsoil to mix in as well, but they're very different things. Compost is considered a soil amendment. It is not soil. It is decomposed organic matter that is rich in microorganisms and nutrients, and it goes into some of the benefits. But soil, and let me move my screen over. Topsoil comes from the top 5 or so inches of the soil, is a part of the soil that has the most organic matter. Its organic material and structure making an ideal growing environment. Topsoil that is manufactured is often a combination of compost and other materials that help with drainage and root support. Very different things. The key thing we try to get across to anyone buying compost for the first time is compost is something you're going to add to your existing soil, not to be used as soil. So choosing the correct type of soil, can be confusing. Many different types have overlapping benefits. Each project, needs a different type of material. So it's essential to know before making a selection. If I have somebody call me and says, actually, I'll pull up these questions here. So, hey, we're about to, we're trying to fill in a hole in our yard. I'm looking for some dirt. I go into an explanation of, what we have available. Now, some of our sites that have multiple products might have something that could work for that, but coming from a compost perspective, you know, it's not the same thing, right? So those are some of the, you know, some of the things that come up. And are you planting anything in the material? You know, if it's a direct plant, we don't suggest doing that with compost. And I'll get into those reasons. Actually, if somebody wants to ask that question, I do have some answers for you on why you don't want to plant directly in the compost. But I'm sure, you know, other composters on a large scale have had issues with customers, you know, calling back and, hey, what happened here? We had leaf curl, or we had, you know, it burnt the, you know, it burnt some of the plant, whatever it may be. It's most likely there can be a misuse of the material. You can use too much of it, which, you know, too much of a, you know, good thing can be a bad thing with compost. So the other question would be, are you top dressing or reconditioning existing soil? Because if you are, I would suggest compost. And then it goes into the three different kinds of materials here. So common misconceptions, we talked about this: compost is dirt, compost is not dirt. It helps build soil structure, conserves water, repels pests, and adds nutrients to the soil. It can be used in a nutrients back into the soil and can be used in the soil. Compost can be planted indirectly, and that is supposed to, oh wait, it goes under here. A compost should not be planted into directly. Instead, compost should be added as a soil amendment to enrich the soil. One of the other reasons that you don't want to plant directly in compost, and it's not to say that it would never work. I mean, if you have, you know, say a yard waste compost, right, that has been sitting for, you know, many years, there's a possibility that it could work because, you know, it's just aged that much. But really, one of the reasons it doesn't work is, you know, compost doesn't provide the same physical structure that soil does, and won't support a plant's necessary roots above soil structures for success and sustained plant growth. So, you know, it needs that soil helps with the roots as well, having a place for it to be. Compost uses. This is, you know, pretty much off the STA. Our compost at least Atlas Organics is STA certified. So, you know, when I have any questions or somebody's, you know, thinking they should use it a different way than I'm suggesting, we always go back to what the SDA, what the US Composting Council is suggesting. You know, it's our kind of our way of explaining how they should do things. Because many people want to use more, many customers, many growers, you know, and it's not something you should do. I think one of the biggest things that I've seen from a sales perspective over the last really couple years, even more in the last year, is everyone's doing or wants to do a raised bed garden, which is great. But compost is not the do all for that. As you can see from a, you know, it's 66% soil mix, 33% compost. That does not equal 100. So whoever did that math, which might probably me, sorry about that, but it's right in that range. Basically, you're using a lot less compost than you are other materials. So there's, you know, pine bark, there's, you know, peat moss, other things you can add to it. It's interesting because that seems to be more of what the consumer wants now. And from a compost, you know, producer's standpoint, that's a product that's going to have the least amount of compost, you know, as a mix. So it's kind of a challenge. With it can be something that's very costly to have something you can plant directly into. You have to be really creative and find ways to use some of the materials that you may have on site to make something that'll work for raised bed mixes. I hope this helps, because this is something I've probably had 30 conversations with this spring about a raised bed garden and how compost should be used. So if you're doing a raised bed and you're putting a bunch of compost in there and it's not working right, here you go. Hope it helps. It also goes into, you know, vegetable gardens and flower beds, you know, how we suggest it should be used. And, you know, 2 inches with a till of 4 to 6 inches. And if you don't like the word till, or maybe incorporating it into the soil. As you know, in our area, we have a lot of clay, so compost helps break that up and really helps the soil structure. And there's backfilling trees and also seed bed prep down here below. All right, last but not least, the most common customers, and I did this from my perspective, it can be different based on what types of compost you make and where you are in the US. So, but I think this covers, what most of them that this would come up. So, one of the biggest, don't know why it skipped. I don't know why you can't see number 2, but that's supposed to be landscapers. So the biggest customers, especially, and Kate actually mentioned this before we started here, one of the biggest customers we're seeing, landscape supply yards, right? So that's where the homeowner, the resident is going to go or landscapers, and get their, 1 yard, 2 yard, smaller orders. So from a producer or manufacturer of compost, some of the, especially at our location in Durham, we try to do a lot more out to the landscape supply yards, and then they sell back to the public. A lot of it can depend on your sites. Some of our sites in Florida, some of them on the West Coast, they're much better set up for, customers coming in there and picking up 1 yard. They have you need the logistics to work out. You need a smaller bucket. You need a whole bunch of different reasons for it to work like that. So one of the biggest customers you do see is the landscape supply yards, because one, the landscapers go in there because at some of those places they can buy mulch, plants, bag material. They can get, instead of coming to us for one thing, they can go there and get 3 or 4 things. So the next one would be landscapers. A lot of landscapers do go to landscape supply yards, but you have large scale, commercial landscapers that have very, very large projects that come up where it doesn't make sense to go to a landscape supply yard. They're going to come to the producer. As you know, there's a lot going on around Raleigh, Durham, all kind of different, developments going up. So that's another large customer as well. And what they do, a lot of times it's not straight compost, which I'll get into on this third one, but it's something mixed in with the compost, a 50-50 mix with topsoil, or that's one of the main ones you'll see. So they could plant more directly into. And then soil blenders. There's companies around us, especially in North Carolina, and they have like sand pits where they have a lot of sand, and a lot of these companies have started to bring in compost, mix into it, and then have special blends with special specs to meet certain commercial landscape jobs, if that makes sense, is another big area we're seeing. And then there's bagging operations. I'm sure you've heard of Scott's or Oldcastle. If you've been in a Home Depot or Lowe's or anything, you see their bags everywhere. Well, they have to, if they're not making it themselves, they have to buy a lot of compost. So they're a very big buyer of materials. And then agriculture, obviously. And it depends on what I found from selling yard waste compost, which is just green waste coming in, sticks, brush, leaves, grass clippings, or if you're making biosolids compost like we do in Durham, it can be a challenge, right? So it depends on what kind of material you're making. With growers that are doing food and maybe they have organic or growing food, have an organic certification, they can't use biosolids compost, right? But maybe they don't have an organic certification. Maybe there's the U factor, and they don't want to use it because of just issues they have with their CSA. So there's all of reasons, but we do see, especially the locations where we make food waste compost and yard waste compost, it's a no-brainer a lot of the times that agriculture is a big customer. And then there's golf courses. We developed a product down in Florida that it's just a finer screen material, because that's what these golf courses are looking for. Unless they're putting in the ground, tilling in the ground, and then putting it above it. If they have to top dress, they want something fine. So if you can make a fine product with not the bigger, some of the sticks you can see from normal size compost, regular size compost, that's something they look for. So, there they are. Last but not least, landscapers. Yeah, so I appreciate it. That's all I got. I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank y'all for listening.
Thanks so much, Robert. We're going to pass it on to Janelle. We're going to save the questions for both of you till the end. So any other audience members that has questions, please pop them in the chat.
Oh, there we go. So hopefully you can see the correct screen and not the split screen that I see. And that you can all hear me. If you can't, scream out. So I'm going to really just quickly, briefly talk about compost and its effect on soil health, because I think that's what is the big thing that everyone's touting right now. Everyone's really concerned about the health of soil. Compost can make a big difference in that. But I think it's really important first to start with the basic soil principles to give everyone a foundation of why it can help build soil health, what nutrient cycling has to play with that, the living component of the soil, and then how we balance that system in utilizing compost. So first and foremost is really and I should introduce myself, Dr. Janelle Olitz. My PhD is in soil science, and I specialize in soil fertility and regenerative agriculture as kind of a background. So soil basics. First and foremost, it's very important to understand the soil is not static at all. It doesn't stay the same thing. If you went out to a soil sample yesterday, take another one today, you sent them off to the lab, they would actually come back different. So it's constantly changing. There's physical, biological, and chemical processes happening within the soil that are influenced by temperature, they're influenced by moisture, they're influenced by the microbial community that live and die constantly. They have very quick life. Understanding that what's going on down there is when you take a soil test, you look at today, it's a snapshot in time. And you use this soil test more of like an average. It gives you kind of a baseline, but it is not the holy grail of exactly what you need. So it's really important to kind of take a look at it, but understand that the things can change based on many, many factors. And soil is like a parfait. It's made up of layers. It starts with the organic layer at the top. Generally, the first 1, 2 can be no if you're in areas that are very tilled up and have lost their organic matter or through erosion. And then you have the kind of the surface soil part, which is known as the A horizon. That's kind of where a lot of the organic matter can get mixed in. It's often where most of the roots live and most of the living component is. Then you have the subsoil, and then you have the parent material. Soil actually is kind of built from or goes from the bottom up. And so this material in the bottom layer is actually, in fact, where all of what is above it has come from. So when we talk about soil, and it's not dirt, dirt's the stuff you clean off your pants when you've been out gardening. Soil is the essence of life and supports life on our planet, along with a little bit of water. And so soil, as a kind of, when we look at it as a component, if I take a shovelful of soil and I were to try to describe what's in it, it's generally about 45% of that or so, give or take a little bit more or less than 50%, is minerals. And that's really what we often think about when we're talking about soil. It's a particular makeup of the particles within that sand, silt, and clay. And then you have the other part of that solid portion is made up of organic matter, which can be anywhere from 0 to hopefully 5% if you're a little bit more north, or maybe even up to 10%. And then the other half of that physical handful or shovelful soil is really just air pockets and spaces that hopefully, if it's healthy, is filled with half water because you need moisture in there, and the other half is air because the organisms and roots of the plants living there actually need air to breathe as well. And so that is what is kind of shown as a healthy soil. And then when I've talked about those mineral components, we have sand, silt, and clay. And so this is not exactly to scale, but if you think about if I looked at it in like a ball, it's like beach ball size, and then we have kind of like a grapefruit size, and then like a little bead size would be kind of what you would think of when you're looking at the components of it. So what I like to say, if you envision a room and you could stick a bunch of beach balls in there, you, without removing any beach balls, could add some silt in there and amongst the spaces between those beach balls. And then you could again add clay without ever actually removing any of the other particles as well, because the smaller particles fill in the space in between. And so this is a really hard concept to get across, but I think this slide does it fairly well in that here we have coarse sand. If I look in this volume, that is a millimeter cubed. That's basically a very square piece of sand, which is just giving you a volume of one piece of sand in a cubic millimeter. In that same size space, if I have clay, I can get 1,000 million pieces of clay in that same space as that one particle of sand. That's how much smaller clay is. But the other important thing to remember is surface area. This here has just the surface area of outside of this sand particle. This explains why when it rains or at the beach and the tide comes in, the water is immediately gone very quickly, because there's not a lot. If you remember from chemistry way back, you have cohesion and adhesion forces that stick. Water loves to stick to surfaces. Well, there's not much surface here for this to stick to. So if it's all just sand, there's not a lot there to hold on to it. But yet all these clay particles have surface all the way around them. And so there's so much more surface area. So the difference in 6 meters square of surface area in this particle of sand here, we have 6,000 cubic millimeters of surface area in this clay. So that kind of just to get your head around why soil that has very high clay can seem very tacky and wet, but still have no moisture left for the plants, which is why compost, and what I'm going to get to, is can help in freeing up some of the soil moisture if you have clay and help lighten it. And so along with that concept, we have bulk density. A lot of numbers here. What I really just want to show you is we have soil textures from sandy all the way to clay. What the ideal bulk densities for plant growth are is less than, if you have sand, it's 1.6, because clay, sand particles are heavier. And then in clay, it's 1.1. So if you do a soil sample, generally you'll see it grams over centimeter cubed. That is the kind of unit of what it weighs for the volume of space that's there. That you want to try to think that the lighter is better on that. And then when it's so dense, like 1.47, that means that it's heavier amount in the same amount of space. It's likely very compacted and very dense, and the roots just can't get through it. So it's just too heavy. So another thing that we also think about when we, it's very hard to compact sandy soil, because you think of the beach balls next to each other, still these huge air spaces in between. They don't stick together very well. But if you have a bunch of clay like we have in our region in the Piedmont, and you drive over it when it's wet, it compacts very easily, squashing all of those little clay particles into all those spaces. And now you have no space for the air and the water that we wanted in that healthy soil, but also for the roots to get through. And so one of the things that we can help relieve that is by increasing organic matter, which is why there's this huge push to say, okay, how do we improve soil health? How do we improve the soil tilth? And that is actually adding this organic matter, which helps to add kind of a spongy bit that it can kind of spring back a little bit more than the clay particles can. And a lot of that actually has to do with the structure of it. So I talked a ton about the minerals, but we're not here for that. We're really here about what's about the compost. And really, it's the organic matter portion. So that's that 5%, give or take, that's in that shovel full of soil I talked about. And what does that mean? Well, it's the living, the dead, and the very dead component of the soil. And what we mean by that is, we are carbon beings, and little microbes are carbon beings, the trees, the grass, all of that, it's made of carbon. It is, when it decomposes, It becomes organic matter, but we are in fact actually organic matter ourselves as we walk, live, breathe. So as the organisms that live in the soil, all those microbes and the worms and the fungi and all that. And this is a circular thing. So it's something that's living, it dies, it decomposes, it's broken down by the microbes, they release the nutrients. The living thing, like a tree, takes up those nutrients, then its leaves fall down, they're dead, and it just keeps going around again, which generally looks like this, where we have the nutrient cycling. And so compost can actually help with that, because as it may be what happens in many places is lots of people love to rake their leaves, or they bag their lawn clippings and they take all the nutrients away. And then now you have the soil that if you recycled those nutrients could go back in, but they've been removed. And so what's happened with our soil is we've removed too much of the nutrients that are there. And now we need to put it back. And the only way to put that back is to bring back the organic matter, which naturally in a forest, if we humans don't get in there and muck with it, you end up with the nutrient cycling happening the way it should in the way the planet was, evolved. So how does this help? Because we are making it more of a natural system. We're balancing it back to the way it should be, and how and no one's going in the forest and fertilizing. It's just doing it itself, cycling it through. And that's because the microbes help to break down those leaves and recycle those nutrients for the next year, because all of what was in those leaves, the tree took up the year before, and it's just recycling it back around. And how does that look on a little bit more of a scientific scale, to break it down in all the components? We have our crop, or whatever we're growing. Maybe if we're farmers, or if we have a lovely natural landscape, it's the ornamental trees that are there. Whatever living plant that's there is going to take up and need carbon dioxide. It needs actually oxygen, and it needs water, as well as the nutrients. And so when that thing either loses its leaves, or it dies, or there's manure from that's added, the residues that are there from that organic matter are broken down by the soil biota. So they need oxygen, they infuse oxygen into the system, but they need oxygen in order to make this process happen. And they decompose it. Through decomposition, you get some carbon dioxide that is lost, as well as water. And hopefully that perhaps utilized by the roots of the plant or the leaves of the plant in photosynthesis. And then through the decomposition, there's also another byproduct, and that is humic matter. And so that goes down in here, and that's really what is becoming part of the organisms that are breaking that down. And then the next step in this process is what's called immobilization. It's a big fancy word for essentially being, well, the microbe had it for lunch and now it's immobilized in the microbe or in the fungi. And so it is not available to be taken up by a plant or anything. It is now part of an organism within the soil. It is immobile. It's not going anywhere. But then that little microbe, well, he has an end of life, and he then releases, as part of his decomposition or its decomposition, proteins and polysaccharides that are just part of its, like chitin and all parts of things of the little beings that as they cycle through their life, that becomes, some of it, part of the soil structure. So it is, in fact, when we talk about carbon sequestration, that's kind of what we mean. It gets locked into the soil and becomes this like humic acid and fumic acid and this really amazing stuff. That's why we want to build organic matter, because that is our savings account for future nutrients that are stuck in there. It becomes part of the structure that makes that soil better. But then some other microbe comes around and says, I'm going to eat this dude that just croaked, and it's going to release this nutrients, and that's called mineralization. So there's only kind of two main processes of nutrients within the soil: immobilization, being locked up; mineralization, now it's being available. And those nutrients are now able to be taken up by other soil biota and as the crop. And so this is really how this cycling happens. So this residue could be compost, and you add that compost in there, and this can add to this whole process, just the same as if there were leaves that were falling down from the tree, or your lawn clippings that you hopefully mulched and left on your lawn. And so this is kind of, when we talk about the soil biota, it's really the soil food web. There's a whole boatload of individuals that live in the soil. of various sizes, and they all kind of live off of this bedrock of organic residue down here on the left. First, you get the actinomyces fungi, the bacteria, and the earthworms that kind of consume that, and then these consume those, and it's just this eat or be eaten kind of world down there that without organic matter, none of these other organisms can really thrive and be there to help release the nutrients that are within that organic residue to all of what's above there, but also what's missing in this is the soil plant roots that can take up those nutrients. There's another component that is often thought of or not thought of or forgotten. And once I say it, everyone's like, oh, duh, is water. Water is what makes nutrients available to our plants. So you can add all the compost you want, but if you're in a drought and there's no water available, doesn't matter how many nutrients are available in that soil, the plant cannot take it up. Plants do not have teeth. They do not have little mouths. They just absorb the nutrients through the pores in their roots, in the root hairs, in fact, actually, and it has to come in the form of liquid. They're on a liquid diet. And there are three main ways that that liquid gets into the plant. First is mass flow. Think of a straw. When you're out and you're having a smoothie in the morning and you're using a straw, that's mass flow. It's just going to come up through by whatever is coming through that straw. Whatever's in there is coming with it. And so that is generally controlled a little bit by temperature with plants, because if your plant isn't evaporating, it's not creating a vacuum and it's not taking up the nutrients. The size of the root system and the mobility of the nutrients. So some nutrients are not going to be taken up by mass flow. Generally, the kind of nutrients that are not kind of stuck often are in the liquid easily. Those are going to go through mass flow. Then you have diffusion. That's kind of like your osmotic potential. It's often controlled by a solute gradient. So think of the salty water and this water with no salt, and nature loves a balance. So you're going to have across the membrane, you will find balance between those eventually. So that's how that plant can get certain nutrients through a diffusion gradient. It chunks out some things of one concentration of a solute, and then it's able to then balance and pull up that other. There's a lot more science involved in it, but we don't have the time to get into it. Just so you know, some nutrients can only be taken up by diffusion. And the acidity of the soil, pH, and your cation exchange capacity, short CEC, those are actually some of the things that control that diffusion gradient. And then lastly, is root interception and phosphorus. Lots of people talk about phosphorus, got to add some phosphorus. Well, phosphorus has to be root intercepted if it's, you add it to the soil. But funny thing is the roots don't grow unless you have phosphorus, because it's kind of a catch-22 if you don't have phosphorus near the roots. However, if you have a really good microbial food web in there and you have very healthy soil because you've been adding compost and you have built up the fungi within the soil, they actually can go out and grab that phosphorus, and in exchange for a little bit of carbohydrate that that plant is making from photosynthesis, there can be an exchange. And so although generally root interception is the main thing you need that root to grow, with a little help from its friends, the microbes will make an exchange. So that is the way around that, which is one of the main reasons why I would encourage anyone to add more organic matter. And don't tilt, because you're killing all those poor little microbes, or do very little. I mean, this kind of on a scale a little bit more kind of microscoped up is just looking at what it looks like here, that this fungi grows into the plant root and is able to do an exchange. It doesn't harm the plant. It actually benefits it greatly. And the plant has most of the microbial community actually living right around the roots. This is called the rhizosphere. And around that's where the microbes all live. And that is kind of wonderful because that's where all the nutrient exchange needs to happen. And so just kind of talking about, like, stepping back and going, okay, here's all the basics of what happens in the soil and the nutrients that are there and how that happens. But what's compost going to do for me? And so And I've just a little bit at the end of talking about the basics of what compost does, as well as kind of just a few basic take-home messages. And first is kind of looking at the type of organic matter, type of compost that you're going to add, actually, and how it changes the soil organic carbon, which kind of can be sort of similar to just soil organic matter. So if you add a green compost, and it can really change it here, in this experiment, it changes it by almost 25%. And then you look at food-based compost, but this is also a meta-analysis. So it looked at, how many years it had been added to the soil. And so not all compost is created equal. It really depends on what it's made out of. If it's highly nutrient dense before it got composted and it was properly composted, it's likely not going to lose all of those nutrients. And so they'll be there for the next thing that you're putting it on and get stored in that. But if it's fairly non-nutrient dense and mostly has lots and lots of carbon and not a lot of nutrients in it, then it probably is not going to give you a lot of nutrients within when you add it to the soil. So it's important to understand what you start with influences what you end up with. And then kind of back to that changing the bulk density. Everyone's like, whoops, I spelled density wrong there. So a lot of people are like, well, I want to fix my soil. And I know Robert had alluded to the ability of being able to add some of that, and it helps the soil as an amendment. And this actually shows, this research, how much can be changed when we add compost, and changing the density, and how much we can decrease it, because that's what we want to do. We want to make it lighter. And you can look at tilling the soil, really didn't do much at all. If anything, it probably makes it worse in the long run. But looking at this compost amendment is probably about as equal as just leaving it alone and reforesting it, which generally is composting it, because every year the leaves are back on it. So how do we make sure, once we've done this compost, that we continue to make sure we achieve soil health? Well, it really looks at, well, how do we influence the nutrient availability? And how do we treat our soil? We don't treat it like dirt. First and foremost, when we till, we break up aggregate stability. So if you till it and make it super fluffy, it's lovely until you step on it, because if you look right where you walk, right after you tilled it, that's where your footsteps are. That's all the compaction. You're squashing it right back down. And this here is called the slake test, and it's basically taking a clod of soil, putting it in water. The one on the left-hand side has been tilled. The one on the right-hand side has not. It's being held together by an amazing microbial food web. And that right there is, if you think of it in a rainstorm, you wouldn't get crusting. The water would go down through the soil. The one on the left, this water drop energy would basically seal the surface of the soil, and then you get runoff, because the water is not going to be able to infiltrate down. The one on the right, the water would make it down through into the bottom. The other thing that influences nutrient availability and our organic matter and the impact of compost is temperature. So microbes are like us, they're active during certain temperatures. Other times they're like, that's it, I'm going somewhere else, or I'm done. And so this is really just a simplified thing of looking at the relationship between temperature and microbial activity. And when it's very cold, they're not active, but yet after 100 degrees Fahrenheit, they're dying off. They're very, very, very hot. And so they're not going to then be around to give your plants nutrients. So one of the main things, the takeaways with this is, if you put compost on as a mulch, that actually helps to cool the surface of the soil. And in fact, actually helps to enhance your microbial activity, because they're not as hot as that crust at the top. So it really boils down to just balancing your soil system. It's really important to understand that everything needs to be taken into consideration, and how much water is in the system, how much temperature is there, and how much organic matter you add into that. So as Robert said, you can't really plant whole hog in 100% compost. It's not going to work. So everything in moderation. So how do you manage for that success? By adding compost, you're going to increase the water holding capacity by two ways. One is you're going to help keep it from compacting. And the other is it's had a little bit of a sponge, has more surface area to hold on to that water. And you reduce the temperature by mulching and helping to add that right onto the top of the surface. Also, reduce your soil disturbance, because, okay, you go ahead and you put a whole bunch of compost in there, and then you till it. When you till, you infuse the soil with oxygen. We do that, the microbes munch through all that organic matter super fast, and they release all the carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere, and you're losing that organic matter that you're trying to add to your soil. So by reducing the disturbance of soil, you're going to reduce how fast the microbes break down the organic matter you've just added. Planting cover crops can help in combination with the compost, because they're going to hold on to the nutrients that are being released if you don't have any actively growing crops at that time. And then it is important to know the source of your compost and understand what you're using it for. So in conclusion, first, I would like to say that do a soil test so you know where you start, so that you kind of understand what you need to adjust. And your cooperative extension agents can help with a little bit of that in trying to interpret that soil test. And then practices for soil health are to increase our organic matter, and how we do that by compost or any other type of organic matter. Incorporating the cover crops, because you want living roots even in the fall and the winter, and reduce the disturbance, keep that organic matter in place. And then lastly, just rotating your crops so that you're ensuring that your organic matter or anything you put down to amend for nutrients, you are putting different things that use different types of nutrients. Helps to balance the whole system, because Mother Nature loves variety. And with that, I know I went super fast, but I apologize. There's a lot to cover in soil. But next time we can dig a little deeper. So that I'm going to skip over this and get to questions. And I will stop sharing. And we lost Muriel already.
She's back.
Hello. No, that was fantastic. So I had one question, just to kind of kick it off, but look at this beautiful full room. Michael, Amy, Alex, Courtney, Rochelle, Tama, Mary, thank you for joining us. Cal, Joe, please. Yay, here we go. Start popping those questions. You can turn on your video, turn off your mute, and get into the conversation. Just shout out your question. My question for Robert, you mentioned STA compost. Can you define that for people? I mean, I'm in the industry, I kind of understand what it means, but why should people look for STA certified compost?
I was on mute. Never gets old. But yeah, it's the seal of the testing and composting council, which basically it holds compost producers to a higher standard with using quality labs, testing frequently, and disclosing specific information about their product. So basically, there's rules and regulations that say, depending on how big or how large or how much intake the facility has, you might have to test, once every month. Some you have to test once every quarter. So there's different rules on volume. But basically it's a way to have a standard for compost producers that go through the STA. Does that make sense?
I think so. Kate's going to jump in.
Yeah, I think, I also work for a large scale compost manufacturer, and we kind of refer to it as like the good housekeeping seal of approval for a compost product. As Robert mentioned, it really dictates quality. I think there's 15 different parameters that they test. And depending again on the size, that could be tested as frequently as monthly, or as infrequently as I think twice a year, somewhere around there. But we just really promote it. You can get a cheat sheet basically from the manufacturer that tells you, what all the qualities of the compost are and what those test parameters were. So it helps you kind of figure out how much compost to use as well.
I think I like it because it compares apples to apples. You've got the same test being applied to maybe different types of compost. So if you have the STA seal, then you know that whether it was made with this type of feedstock or another type of feedstock, then it still is undergoing the same uniform testing. So you can have sort of a standard of quality that, you know, other variable types of testing won't give you the same standard. So that's kind of why I think of it as sort of the, you know, the preferred methodology for compost. The thing too with compost is something that you brought up, Robert, like depending on the manufacturer, depending on the processes, depending on where you're getting it from, like some may not be going through all of the, you know, mesophilic and thermophilic practices that reduce pathogens and reduce weed seeds, or, you know, that have cured for a certain amount of time and so forth. So, you know, there's, you know, we want to make sure that there's a high quality of compost going out there so that, you know, when people buy compost, they know that they can trust it. That's a huge issue. And, you know, what you were talking about, like planting in compost and planting, not just in straight compost, but creating a soil mix. If you're going to do a bioassay test or something like that to test if a plant grows well in a particular compost, if you put it in just straight compost, like anything could happen. You could get root rot, you could have other things that affect it that don't actually have to do with the quality of the compost. So the STA standard sort of helps with that. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I think a big
Okay.
part of it, like you said, with the pathogens and the metals, it you know, that it's given, you know, you have certain limits that you have to make, because that's a big question that comes up for consumers all the time is, you know, how is it, you know, with pathogens and metals, and does it pass what it needs to pass?
So it looks like we got some more questions in the chat. Michael said, I've been composting for over 10 years. Awesome. And continue to learn. But recently I've been adding more coffee grounds from a local coffee shop on a weekly basis. This added to the huge amount of leaf debris from late fall, winter, along with standard kitchen waste. My question, besides a compost soil test, how can I tell when it's too much coffee grounds detrimental? So.
Well, I guess I can talk about the coffee grounds can generally tend to change your pH of your soil. And there's a difference between a compost test and a soil test. So a soil test is actually going outside into the actual soil, taking a bunch of samples around a yard or garden space, putting it all together and taking that test and sending it off to the lab where it'll be analyzed. You can actually have your compost tested, but that's an organic matter test, which is separate, but will give you the nutrients within that test. But adding coffee grinds to your soils on the surface can be good. However, too much can lead to changing your acidity, which then actually, in fact, changes your nutrient availability. So that's a little bit is good. Better to actually add them to a compost pile, compost them within and add it all together, and then use that compost with leaves and grinds and properly brought up to over 150 degrees 5 times and all that, compost it properly, then add it to the soil as an amendment, much better. And that's what I would say for that. I can answer the next one, which is what soil material do you recommend adding to compost? So soil is just soil made up of sand, silt, and clay. But the type of soils, we have descriptions of sandy loam and all that, and it's just the percentage of how much sand, silt, and clay, and in the combinations make up those soil textures. But soil is soil. It is what, if you take a shovelful out in the backyard, what you get is the soil, and then it's just made up of a bunch of different things. And so I would say that anything you add to the compost, if as long as it's soil, is going to have those structural components needed to support life.
I'd say the soil in your backyard is the good soil to add compost to.
Sorry, I guess I was a little unclear with that question. I guess I'm more like, I don't have a backyard. I'm in an apartment, so I'm container gardening. So there's, you know, obviously a ton of options for things that you can purchase, like coco coir or sphagnum moss or stuff like that.
That's all organic matter. It's not actually soil. So if you're looking for a container garden, what you want to look for is planting mix, not potting mix. And so if it says it's a raised bed mix, it will have soil in it already, but not a lot of soil, because for a container garden, there's specific things you need to have added in there to keep from compaction. So soil down out in the backyard doesn't seem to, because it has the soil food web, doesn't compact. But if you take a shovel full of soil and just put it in, say, like a pot, and you plant a pot and you water it, it compacts into concrete no matter what type you have, unless it's just sand. So if you're doing a raised bed, looking for a raised bed mix or planting mix, but potting mix for a raised bed is not the same when you're trying to do that kind of a volume. Hope that answers the question.
What I like to do is buy super cheap, like topsoil, and mix it with compost, and then add some kind of fluffing agent, because it can be really heavy. If it's just compost and topsoil, add something that'll add a little bit of floof to it to make my own potting soil with compost that I make at home. So I also have done a lot of containers. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking because we are almost out of time. But I want to say that Janelle, Robert, Kate, and I, we are all North Carolina Composting Council board members, and our annual meeting is coming up. If you want to talk more in person with any of these experts, they're amazing in the communal knowledge that they have about soil health, compost, and everything, and the carbon sequestration, the impact on the environment, all that. It's pretty exponential. And Kate just popped the link to register for the annual meeting that's coming up on June 15th in the chat. So sorry to interrupt you guys. We have about 2 minutes left though, and I wanted to respect the time. I think with Mike's question also, he's definitely composting it. And so I mean, coffee grounds are a great nutrient source. I say, you know, the more the better if you have a good balance of carbon and nitrogen that comes from leaves and coffee grounds, so long as it's composted, as Janelle and Robert have both described, you're going to have a beautiful compost.
And Robert does have a hard stop at 2 o'clock. So if there's any last minute questions for Robert real quick before he heads off. Looks like we're good. Thank you so much, Robert. Really appreciate you contributing today.
Thank y'all. Thanks, Muriel. Thanks, Janelle. Thanks, Kate. See y'all. Appreciate it.
Yeah. And it looks like we have another question real quick. I did, in the meantime, as Muriel mentioned, pop some links into the chat of our upcoming annual members and friends meeting, as well as our sustainable spirits. We've got 2 of those coming up, one May 18th and one June 15th. So please take a look at those links, as well as our social media. If you're not following us already, please follow us. And then the last question looks like, I have a lot of tree limbs, large and small, that I create brush piles with for the birds, etc. However, HOA complains about sticks and leaves, so I spread them out around the back of the yard too. Slightly worried, as some people have told me that too many layers of sticks can keep oxygen out. How many branches or sticks are okay? Thanks for your help today. The science was fascinating.
I've never heard of the oxygen thing. I would think it actually increases oxygen because it makes more air pockets. Perhaps they are meaning, I'm just going on a limb here, and they're confusing that with nitrogen. Oh, sorry, that was a pun.
That was a pun. That was great.
So often they say too much of like wood chips and things like that. If you're adding it to a pile, you'll lock up your nitrogen. So and that really is, there's a whole lot of science behind it, and it has to do with microbes and all of that. And they just, to have a high amount of carbon to nitrogen, it doesn't, your nitrogen isn't available for the plants. But other than that, I can't see how that would lock up oxygen. If anything, the microbes are going to be in there and releasing all that. That would not be the thing that I would be worried about. Just keep on keeping on with the piles of sticks and stuff, because that's good for many, many, many things. Lots of our pollinators like to live in places like that. And so, yeah, leave the leaves and sticks and twigs. Exactly. So if you're going to pull off, like, even if you have some dead flowers, leave them until the spring. I know your HOA might not like that, but there's little critters living in there till they grow up and fledge. Oh, it looks like there's not any more questions. It was great questions. Really awesome.
We're super excited about this event. It was our first ComCon. I think that, we would love any feedback that you guys have. Our last ComCon is tomorrow. I'm going to be live in my backyard composting and talking about indoor composting with worms and also outdoor composting with a conventional commercial bin and other things. So please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. And thank you so much.